I want you to take a deep breath. Just look at the empty space between your nose and the wall right now, or the steering wheel, or whatever is right in front of you.
Yeah, just look at the absolute nothingness of it.
Right, because standard physics, and frankly, just basic human common sense, tells us that this space is an empty stage. You know, it's just where reality happens. It's the void.
The box we all live in.
Exactly, the box. But what if I told you that the supposedly empty void you are looking at right now is actually burning raw mathematical energy just to keep itself from collapsing?
Which is a wild thought.
It is. What if that three-dimensional space isn't a passive container at all? What if it's a highly engineered, actively generated state?
I mean, that completely upends centuries of how we've been taught to look at the universe.
Totally.
If space is an engineered state like an active process, then it has to have a source.
Right.
It means the stage didn't just pre-exist the actors. It forces us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question, which is, what built the stage before the play even started?
And that is the massive brain-breaking question we are exploring today. Welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
So we are unpacking an incredibly dense and genuinely radical body of work today by Philip Lilien. It's called the Unified Coherence Closure Framework.
Or the UCCF, for short.
Right, UCCF. And we've got a massive stack of his foundational papers, some strategic briefings, and a few incredibly intricate dimensional diagrams sitting right here on the table.
Very dense stuff.
Super dense. But the mission of this deep dive is to figure out how our three-dimensional reality actually emerges from what Lilien calls let me get this right, a predimensional invariant seed layer.
You got it.
Awesome. We're going to explore why the universe couldn't just start with 3D space. And we'll discover how this mathematical architecture perfectly sets the stage for life itself to exist.
Yeah, and we really need to acknowledge right up front just how far outside the traditional bounds of physics this framework steps.
I mean, yeah, it's way out there.
Right, because the physics we use every day is incredibly successful, but it almost always starts after the curtain goes up, so to speak.
Right.
Think about Newton. He gave us absolute space, just a fixed, rigid grid.
Like a piece of graph paper.
Exactly. Then Einstein came along with general relativity and showed us that space and time are woven together into space-time, and that fabric can bend and warp.
Yeah, bowling balls on a trampoline, all that.
Right, but Einstein still started with the fabric already existing.
Oh, I see. He didn't explain where the trampoline came from.
Exactly. And even in quantum field theory, where particles are just excitations in underlying fields, those fields are still mathematically formulated over a spatial background that is already assumed to be there.
Right, so it's like physics is an incredibly detailed manual on how to act out a play. You know, how the lighting works, how the sound travels to the back row.
Yeah.
But the manual just sort of assumes the actual theater building was always just sitting there on the street corner.
That's a perfect way to put it. The UCCF essentially asks us to put down the actor's manual and go backstage.
Okay.
To the construction site, really. Before the theater is even poured into concrete, it tries to explain what makes dimensional emergence possible before dimension itself is even available.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because going backstage before space even exists is a really tough concept to wrap your head around.
It's extremely counterintuitive.
Right, because if we want to understand where space comes from, we obviously can't use space to explain it, right?
Yeah, we can't.
Like, if I say, well, space came from a bigger, older space, I haven't actually solved anything. Just kick the can down the road.
You've just described the trap of infinite regress.
Okay.
If you try to explain the origin of a spatial dimension by pointing to a higher dimension, say a 4D bulk or a 5D membrane, like in string theory, you are still relying on coordinate geometry to explain coordinate geometry.
Which is a circular argument.
Exactly. To truly find the origin of dimensionality, the source material argues that the foundation has to be completely non-dimensional.
Completely.
It has to exist in a layer of reality that is deeper than physical extension, deeper than an X, Y, and Z axis, deeper than geometry itself.
So if I'm picturing this, we are talking about a state of reality where there is literally no up, no down, no left, no right.
Right.
But it's even more severe than that, isn't it? There isn't even a tiny microscopic dot. Because a dot still implies like a coordinate in some sort of arena.
Yes, exactly. There is no physical where and there is no when.
Okay, that is terrifying. So what is there?
Well, what you are describing is what Lilien refers to as the predimensional seed layer.
The seed layer.
Right. Because we can't use physics or geometry to describe it since those don't exist yet, he argues that this layer must be defined by pure logic, specifically four-seed equations.
Okay, equation.
But it is crucial to understand that we shouldn't view these as equations in the traditional sense. You aren't meant to write them on a chalkboard and solve for x.
Right.
Lilien calls them ontological invariants.
Wait, I want to push back on that a little bit for you listening at home. Because if there is no space and there's no physical universe yet, what exactly are these equations?
That's the big question.
Like, where do they live?
Yeah.
If there's no universe to hold them, are they just floating mass in a void? Because honestly, that sounds more like mysticism than science to me.
Yeah, the discomfort you were feeling is entirely intended by the framework. But let's reframe that. Don't think of them as floating numbers.
Okay, what are they then?
Think of them as the irreducible logical preconditions for existence. They are the absolute baseline grammar of reality.
The grammar of reality.
Yes. If these specific logical rules do not hold true, then nothing, no universe, no physical matter, no space can ever happen. They are invariant because they do not change, they do not degrade, and they do not depend on space or time.
Because they aren't physical.
Right.
Yeah.
They simply are the rules of possibility.
You know, it feels almost like the source code of a computer simulation.
That's a great analogy.
Like, before you boot up the physical hardware, the RAM, the processors, the physical screen, you have this underlying source code that establishes the basic logic of how data can even behave once the power is eventually turned on.
That analogy holds up surprisingly well throughout the text. It establishes that unity and persistence are fundamental, not just accidents of how the universe formed.
Okay, so let's look at the first line of that source code.
Lilien calls it the coherence seed.
And mathematically, how is that written?
It is written as 0 to the power of 0 equals 1.
Okay, 0 to the 0 equals 1, which immediately is going to make anyone who remembers high school algebra just sort of twitch.
Oh, absolutely.
Like if you type 0 to the power of 0 into your smartphone calculator right now, it gives you an error. It just says it's undefined.
And in standard calculus, when you're dealing with continuous limits, it often is treated as undefined. But in fields like combinatorics and set theory, 0 to the 0 is strictly defined as 1.
Combinatorics. That's the math of counting, right?
Counting and arranging sets. Exactly. If you ask, how many ways are there to map an empty set to another empty set? The logical answer is exactly one way.
So the mapping exists.
Right. The mapping exists as a single coherent truth, even if the sets contain absolutely nothing. Lilien takes this mathematical convention and elevates it into a really profound ontological statement.
So translating that from math to reality 0 to the power of 0 equals 1 means that unity, like a coherent state of 1, can emerge directly from nullity.
Yes. From absolute zero or nothingness.
Take that a step further for me.
Well, it proves that coherence is logically more primitive than physical extension. You do not need a pre-existing physical space or energy or particles to have a coherent state of unity. Coherence is self-justifying.
Okay, so before there is any physical stuff at all, there is simply the logical rule that a unified state is permitted to exist out of a null state. The source code basically says, yes, unity is allowed.
Precisely. Now we move to the second line of the source code.
Let's do it.
The identity seed. This is written as 0 factorial equals 1.
Let's refresh factorials really quickly for everyone. A factorial is just multiplying a sequence of descending integers, right?
Yeah, exactly. So 3 factorial is 3 times 2 times 1.
Which is us.
Right. And 4 factorial is 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, which is 24. It's usually used to figure out how many different ways you can arrange a set of objects.
Which makes 0 factorial conceptually really strange.
Very strange, because how many ways can you arrange 0 objects?
None.
Actually, the mathematical answer is 1.
Wait, really?
Yeah. There is exactly one way to arrange nothing, and that is by doing nothing to it. You are essentially applying an empty operation to an empty set, and the answer yields a 1.
So applying an empty operation to nothing still yields a unified identity.
Yes.
How does that translate into a foundational rule for the universe, though?
It translates to the concept of ontological persistence. For any...
It has to persist even when no transformation is happening to it.
Exactly. Imagine if a physical law required constant interaction just to exist. If a structure loses its identity, the absolute moment an operation stops, you could never form a stable, resting universe.
Because it would just dissolve.
Right. The identity seed is the logical guarantee that a structure can persist before a physical process is even applied to it.
That makes a ton of sense. It's literally the rule of persistence. Without it, the moment the universe paused, it would just blink right out of existence.
Exactly.
The source code requires that things can maintain their identity. Okay, so we have coherence and we have identity. What is the third piece?
The third is the scale seed.
Scale.
And this one is written as infinity to the power of 0 equals 1.
Infinity to the 0 power. Wow. So we are taking unlimited, infinite potential, like something without any boundaries at all, and we're raising it to a 0 exponent and getting a single unified one.
Right.
That seems like a massive jump from just dealing with zeros.
What's fascinating here is how this tackles the problem of physical scale. Think about the nature of infinity.
Okay.
If the underlying potential of existence is infinite and completely unbound, how do you ever get a localized, finite object?
Right. How do you get just a piece of it?
Exactly. How do you get a single electron or a single planet or, a single room? If you couldn't logically bind infinity, the universe would just be a diffuse, infinite wash of raw, uncontained potential.
Because it would just stretch forever in every conceptual direction. Nothing could ever have a distinct boundary.
Precisely. But the scale seed proves that unlimited, infinite potential can be locally bounded.
By raising it to the 0 power?
Yes. By raising it to the power of 0, which is applying a local closure, it resolves into a unified one. It means you can draw a conceptual boundary around a piece of infinity without exhausting or breaking the infinite nature of the whole.
Wow.
This invariant condition is the absolute prerequisite for localized reality to form.
Okay, let me stop and just make sure I am mapping this out correctly for you listening, because this is dense stuff.
It's very dense.
We are still backstage. We are in the predimensional void. There's no space, no time, no geometry. But we have 3 logical rules locked into place in the source code.
Right.
Coherence, which means unity can emerge from nothing. Identity, which means a structure maintains its identity even if nothing is acting on it. And scale-boundedness, which means you can take infinite potential and place a local boundary on it to make a distinct unified thing.
You have the foundation perfectly mapped.
Yeah.
But there is a massive structural problem at this stage.
Good problem. Right, because right now, nothing is actually doing anything. It's frozen.
Exactly. The framework describes this state as completely static. We have unity, we have persistent identity, and we have the capacity for bounded scale.
Oh.
But there is no transformation. There is no movement. There is no rotation, no relation between different states.
Yeah.
And therefore, there is no way to generate an actual spatial dimension. If reality just stayed at those first 3 seeds, the universe would just be a frozen, dimensionless, logical tautology.
So it's like a computer that has been plugged in, the source code is written, but nobody has actually hit run.
Precisely.
Which brings us to the 4th seed in Lilien's framework, the Euler gateway.
The Euler gateway.
This is where the source code actually initiates, right?
Yes. The Euler gateway is arguably the most critical threshold in the entire UCCF.
Let's hear the math.
Mathematically, Lilien writes it as negative e to the power of I times pi equals 1.
Okay, negative e to the I pi equals 1. Now, for anyone who took calculus or honestly even just watched a few math videos on YouTube, this is a variation of Euler's identity.
Right, which is famously written as e to the I pi plus 1 equals 0.
Exactly. And mathematicians just obsess over Euler's identity because it takes the 5 most fundamental constants in mathematics, e, I, pi, 1, and 0, and ties them all into one seemingly magical, perfect equation.
It really is beautiful.
But Lilien deliberately rewrites it here. He moves the 1 to the other side of the equal sign and makes the e term negative. Why that specific rearrangement?
Because Lilien isn't just balancing an equation here, he is describing a geometric and ontological process.
Oh, I see.
By formulating it as negative e to the I pi equals 1, the framework places all the emphasis on the concept of return.
Return, like coming back.
Right. The equation describes a journey that ends exactly where it started. Let's unpack the components individually, because each piece of this mathematical notation represents a brand new physical capability for the universe.
Let's do it. Let's start with the letter E.
Okay, the constant E, Euler's number, is the base of the natural logarithm. In math, it represents exponential unfolding, continuous growth, or continuous change.
Right.
So ontologically, E is the introduction of a generative process. Suddenly, our static unity has the capacity to unfold.
It's growing. Next is the exponent, which contains I and pi. Let's start with I. That's the imaginary unit, right? The square root of -1.
Yes. And in complex geometry, multiplying by I corresponds to a 90-degree rotation. It introduces phase.
Phase.
Yeah, it takes you off the standard flat number line and pushes you into a completely new orthogonal space. It's basically the birth of lateral relation.
And then that I is multiplied by pi, which we all know is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. So pi represents curvature.
Exactly. Specifically, an I times pi exponent represents a rotation of exactly 180 degrees.
Like a half circle.
Right, a half-circle path through the complex plane. So we have unity exponentially unfolding with E, shifting phase with I, and curving along a path with pi.
But the whole term has a negative sign in front of it. It's negative E.
And that negative sign represents negation, reversal, or opposition.
Right.
The unfolding journey has completed its 180-degree phase shift, and then the negation flips it another 180 degrees.
Pulling it all the way back around.
Exactly.
Okay, I want to try and build an analogy here for the listener so we aren't just swimming in abstract math symbols.
Please do.
Think of those first three static seed equations as a single dot drawn on a blank piece of paper. It has identity, it's coherent, but it's just a dot sitting there.
Static.
Right. The Euler gateway is like taking a string, pinning one end to that dot, and tying a pencil to the other end.
I like this.
The E is the tension in the string, pulling away from the dot. The I and the pi are the pencil swinging outward, drawing an arcing, curved path away from the center point.
You're definitely brushing up against the truth there, but consider what happens when that arc is actually completed. The I times pi only draws a half circle.
Right.
You are now perfectly opposite your starting point. You haven't made a full circle yet.
Right. And that is exactly where the negative sign kicks in, the reversal. The negative sign forces the pencil to mirror that journey, pulling it all the way back around to the starting dot. You've drawn a perfect circle.
Yes.
You went on a journey of transformation, extending outward, but you safely arrived back at the unified one where you began.
And this raises an incredibly important question. Why is that specific journey, the ability to leave, curve, and return, so vital to the existence of space?
Yeah, why?
According to the UCCF, dimensionality formally begins when unity becomes rotationally recoverable. That is the absolute golden rule of this framework.
Rotationally recoverable.
Yeah.
Because before Euler, unity was brittle. It was just sitting there.
Right. If you tried to change it, you might break it.
Oh.
And if relation or transformation destroys unity, then a persistent dimension cannot exist. Think about what a physical dimension actually is.
It's an arena.
It is an extended path where objects can move, forces can relate, and structures can transform, while the overarching arena itself remains intact.
Right. The room doesn't break just because I walk across it.
Exactly. The Euler gateway proves that unity can endure phase displacement, it can endure rotation, it can endure curvature, and it can negate that displacement to return to itself without breaking. It proves that transformation is safe.
So Euler is literally the gateway. We pass through this equation, and suddenly the source cone isn't just static logic anymore. It has a path, it has curvature, it has the capacity for relation.
It's awake.
Right? It's awake. So do we finally have the 3D room we are sitting in? Has the space booted up?
We do not.
Well, we don't.
No, and this is where the physics of the framework gets intensely structural. The Euler gateway opens the door to dimensional possibility, but it does not instantly create crisp, perfectly organized, flat, three-dimensional space.
Okay, what does it create then?
Instead, when unity passes through the Euler gateway and realizes it can rotate, it erupts into a highly energetic, oversaturated state. Lilien calls this the 3.14 dA threshold of dimensional availability.
The 3.14D threshold. Now, I have to admit, when I first read this specific terminology in the source material, my mind immediately jumped to fractals.
Oh, sure.
Like the Mandelbrot set, or how a jagged coastline isn't a 1D straight line, but it's not a 2D square either, so mathematicians assign it a fractional dimension, like 1.25 or whatever. Is this 3.14D a physical fractal space?
It is an incredibly common misconception when people first encounter this text, but the author is explicit. No.
Not a fractal.
Not at all. The 3.14D threshold is not a fractional physical dimension like a Hausdorff dimension used in fractal geometry. You cannot take a ruler and measure a 3.14 dimensional object.
Okay, so what is the 3.14 pointing to?
It is a symbolic ontological notation. 3.14 obviously points to pi. It represents a generative threshold of pure curvature.
What exactly does a generative threshold mean in this context? Like physically?
Think of it as a pre-spatial curvature field. Through the Euler gateway, unity has just discovered rotation and phase. It is completely saturated with curvature potential.
Just vibrating with it.
Yes. It is bursting with the raw active energy required to make dimensions happen, but it hasn't organized itself into a stable, flat structure yet.
So it's messy.
Very messy. It is in a state of dimensional availability, but it is simply too saturated with excess phase energy to act as a persistent, stable 3D space where matter could actually exist.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. Because if this 3.14D state is too chaotic and curvature heavy for matter, the universe has to somehow get from that saturated 3.14D mess down to the crisp, flat 3.0D space that we actually live in.
It has to step down.
Right. And the framework calls this necessary downgrade the curvature cost transition.
And we must be very precise with our language here. This transition is an ontological reduction.
An ontological reduction.
Right. It is a physical necessity. The universe does not just look at 3.14 on a cosmic spreadsheet and say, well, let's round down to 3 for convenience.
Right. It's not an accounting trick. It's a structural requirement.
Exactly. The 3.14D threshold literally possesses too much curvature. Normal, stable, extended spatial dimensions axes that stay straight and predictable cannot express all of that inherent twisting curvature directly.
It would tear the space apart.
Yes. If the universe wants to build a stable, persistent architectural space, it has to constrain that wild, phase-rich energy. It has to force the chaotic curvature to lock into rigid stability.
Let me see if I can build a real-world analogy to help picture this ontological reduction, because it's a really heavy concept.
Go for it.
Imagine a master glassblower working in a studio. The 3.14D state is the glowing, molten glass right after it gets pulled out of the furnace.
Okay, I can picture that.
It is fluid, it's radiating intense heat, it's glowing orange, and it has almost infinite potential to curve, stretch, and bend in any direction.
Yeah.
It's totally saturated with energy.
Right.
But if you want to use it, if you want it to be a stable 3.0D vase that can actually hold water without collapsing, you can't leave it in that molten state.
No, you have to let it cool down. It has to freeze into a rigid geometric structure.
Well, wait, let me push that analogy even further. Because when the glass cools and freezes into that rigid 3.0D vase, what actually happens to the heat? What happens to the energy that made it so fluid in the first place?
It radiates away.
Right. It doesn't just vanish into a black hole. It radiates out into the room. It warms up the air. It warms up the tools. It hits the glassblower's skin.
Yep.
The fundamental energy that made it fluid is conserved. It just changes form and impacts the environment around the newly stabilized object.
That captures the mechanics of the transition brilliantly, and that is exactly what the curvature cost transition dictates.
Oh, wow.
The universe has to pay a physical cost to freeze that molten 3.14D potential into stable, rigid 3.0D space.
What's the math on that cost?
Mathematically, that excess curvature being shed is represented as delta kappa. The formula is delta kappa equals pi minus 3.
Okay, pi minus 3, which calculates to an excess of approximately 0.14159.
Precisely. So the universe literally sheds that 0.14159 curvature cost to stabilize the stage.
Okay, so where does it go?
Just like the heat radiating from your glass base, that excess curvature value of 0.14159 is not discarded. It doesn't evaporate into nothingness. The UCCF states that this excess is formally conserved as spatial resonance.
Spatial resonance.
Right. It is absorbed into what Lilien calls the infratier of reality.
Infratier.
It trickles down to power the continuous rotational stabilization of the universe. And more importantly, it physically funds the fundamental forces of physics that operate within the space.
I really want to make sure you listening are grasping the magnitude of this. The very act of space cooling down into a stable, empty-looking 3D arena is the engine that generates the energy required for the physics happening inside that arena.
It's beautiful.
The emptiness of space is what powers the stuff inside space. That is wild.
It is wild. And that dynamic leads to one of the most profound paradigm shifts in Lilien's work. The principle of immanent generativity.
I love this concept. Let me try to explain why. You tell me if I'm tracking correctly.
Correct.
When we talk about the universe cooling down, it's really easy to think about it chronologically.
Like a timeline.
Right.
Yeah.
Like at the moment of the Big Bang, there was a fleeting microsecond where the universe was in this molten 3.14D state. Then it cooled into 3.0D, and now the 3.14D state is just gone forever. It's just history. But immanent generativity says that's totally wrong.
You are tracking perfectly. It is entirely wrong to view it chronologically. The 3.14D threshold never vanishes.
Never.
It does not exist in the past. It exists in the depth. It remains everywhere, imminently present right now. It is the underlying curvature coherence condition that is continuously actively generating and maintaining the 3.0D space at this very millisecond.
Wow. So if I look back at the empty space between my nose and the steering wheel, I am not actually looking at nothing.
No, you aren't.
I am looking at the stabilized, cooled-down surface layer of a raging, curvature-saturated engine that was hiding just behind the veil of perception, constantly projecting the 3D space I'm sitting in. Space isn't a passive empty box. It's the exhaust or the stabilized appearance of this deeper dimensional machinery.
Space is simply dimensionality after its curvature potential has achieved stabilized closure.
Okay, my mind is thoroughly blown by the glass-blowing engine of reality, but let's keep moving, because we have a lot to cover.
We do.
The universe has paid the curvature cost. The molten glass is cooled. We now have a persistent, stable 3.0 dimensional spatial arena.
The stage is built.
The stage is finally built. But we can't stop there. We need to look at what this stabilized stage is actually structurally capable of doing.
Yeah.
Because a 3D space isn't just three isolated lines drawn on graph paper.
Right.
Those dimensions have to actually relate to one another.
They absolutely do. And this brings us to a critical analytical step called relational closure capacity.
Okay, relational closure capacity. Let's break that down.
In standard stabilized 3D space, you have three primary axes, the X, Y, and Z axes.
Up, down, left, right, forward, backward.
But to understand the true generative capacity of that space, how complex it can theoretically get, you have to calculate how those three axes internally interact and relate to one another.
Okay.
If you have three primary axes, their full relational interaction yields a field capacity of 3 squared, which is 9.
Okay, 3 squared equals 9. Now, the source material breaks down this ninefold capacity very specifically. It's not just, 9 random things you can do in space.
No, it's very precise.
It decomposes into a precise mathematical matrix.
It decomposes into 3 distinct structural components, which actually map perfectly to a 3x3 tensor matrix if you are looking at it through standard physics.
Let's hear the 3 components.
First, you have a scalar trace. This accounts for 1 degree of capacity.
What does a scalar trace do?
It represents the phase identity component, basically the overarching scale and volume of the space.
Okay, so that's 1.
Second, you have antisymmetric rotation, which accounts for 3 degrees of capacity.
Antisymmetric rotation.
Yes, and this corresponds to the mathematical group SO3. It represents spatial rotational stabilization.
Oh, I see.
It's the ability of the space to maintain its internal coherence when objects rotate within it along the X, Y, or Z planes.
Which makes sense, because if I throw a spinning baseball in a room, the space itself doesn't tear apart.
Exactly.
The space has the capacity to handle 3D rotation. So that's 1 for the scalar trace plus 3 for the rotation. We are at 4. What's the last piece?
Finally, you have symmetric deformation, which accounts for the remaining 5 degrees of capacity.
Deformation, like stretching.
Yes. This involves how the space handles stress, shear, and internal expansion without breaking.
Okay, so a scalar trace of 1, antisymmetric rotation of 3, and symmetric deformation of 5, 1 plus 3 plus 5 equals the full ninefold relational capacity of our stabilized 3D space.
You've got it.
Okay, so we've mapped out the 9 degrees of freedom in 3D space. But here is where Lilien introduces a calculation that genuinely made me just sort of pause and stare at the wall for a few minutes.
It's a beautiful calculation.
It's called the curvature residue heuristic. Let's walk through the math of it slowly, because the conceptual payout is immense.
Let's do it.
I'll set it up. We take that full relational capacity of 3D space we just mapped out, which is 9.
Right.
But space doesn't get to keep all of that capacity for free. It has to expend energy to maintain its fundamental curvature cycle.
Correct. We must subtract the foundational expenditure of one complete curvature cycle. In mathematics and physics, a full cycle of curvature, a complete rotation, is represented by 2 times pi, or 2 pi radians.
Right, a full circle.
So the heuristic calculation is the full spatial capacity, which is 9, minus the full curvature cycle, which is 2 pi.
Okay, let's do the math on that. 9 minus 2 pi. 2 times pi is approximately 6.28318.
Right.
So 9 minus 6.28318 leaves us with approximately 2.7168.
Now look closely at that resulting number, 2.7168.
Yeah.
In the grand lexicon of mathematics, what universal constant is that remarkably close to?
Is incredibly close to the Eulerian constant, lowercase e.
Exactly.
Which is roughly 2.7183. We are talking about a mathematical variance of just about 0.054%.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer architectural symmetry of this is breathtaking. Think about the conceptual journey we just took from the very beginning of the deep dive. Euler's signature literally brackets the entire structure of reality.
Wait, you're right. Before dimension even emerges, Euler is the catalyst.
Yes.
Negative e to the I pi equals 1. It's the string and the pencil drawing the arc. It is the phase gateway that forces the static seed layer to wake up and become dimensionally available.
And then, at the very end of the cosmological process, after the universe has cooled through the 3.14D threshold, and after it has stabilized into a rigid 3.0D space,
Yeah.
and after you take its full ninefold relational capacity and subtract the expenditure of its innate curvature cycle, Euler miraculously reappears.
Wow.
It emerges as the foundational curvature residue. The signature is embedded in the math of the stabilized arena.
It's like an architect who signs his name on the very first foundation stone of a skyscraper.
That's a perfect analogy.
And then years later, when the entire building is finished, you take a helicopter up and look down at the roof, and the geometric shape of the entire completed structure spells out the exact same signature.
Yes, it's built into the macro just as it was in the micro.
It is a profound structural indication that source coherence and curvature potential are never actually destroyed. They are perfectly conserved throughout the entire violent emergence of reality. From the absolute predimensional void to the stable, boring physical room you are sitting in right now, the structural residue of that journey is literally written into the background math of space itself.
It's poetry, really.
Now, I do want to throw a flag on the play here for the listener, just to maintain our intellectual rigor.
Sure.
Lilien is very careful in his papers to refer to this 9 minus 2 pi calculation as a heuristic and not a pure, literal physical derivation.
He does.
So why does that variance exist, and why is the calculation still important if it isn't perfectly equal to E?
That is a vital distinction to make. A heuristic is a conceptual problem-solving tool. He is not claiming that if you subtract 2 pi from 9, you mathematically generate exactly E to infinite decimal places.
Okay, so what is the variance?
The 0.054% variance likely represents the continuous, slight energetic cost of immanent stabilization.
Oh, like friction.
Exactly like friction. It's the friction of reality constantly maintaining itself, so to speak. But the heuristic serves as an ontological, conceptual bridge. It shows that the fingerprints of the predimensional source code are visible in the final architectural product. It proves that the transition from a logical seed layer to a spatial layer is not an arbitrary accident. It follows a strict internal logic of conserved curvature.
Okay, so we've built the stage, we've stabilized the 3D space, we've measured its ninefold relational capacity, and we've accounted for the curvature cost and the Eulerian residue.
We have.
But earlier, during the glass blowing analogy, we established that the excess curvature, that 0.14159 heat radiating off the molten 3.14D glass, is conserved to power downstream structures.
Right, it doesn't disappear.
So where exactly does that excess energy go?
The excess curvature trickles down into what the UCCF calls the infratier. This is where we transition from discussing the empty geometric structure of space itself to discussing the actual, tangible physical forces that operate within that space.
Ah, okay.
We are moving from the architecture to the plumbing and electricity. We are talking about the emergence of the fundamental forces of physics.
So now we are entering the territory of the standard model of particle physics.
Yes, we are.
For listeners who might be a bit rusty on their quantum mechanics, the standard model is basically the crowning achievement of 20th century physics. It is the framework that explains electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force that holds atoms together, and the weak nuclear force that causes radioactive decay.
It explains basically everything in the universe except gravity.
Right. And it is arguably the most extensively tested and successful scientific theory in human history. To describe these forces, the standard model relies on a mathematical framework called gauge theory.
That's right.
It uses specific mathematical symmetry groups called gauge generators to dictate how particles interact. Specifically, the standard model utilizes 12 internal gauge generators.
Let's break down those 12 generators so we know exactly what the accepted science is before we look at how Lilien critiques it.
Perfect. So let's look at the breakdown.
First, it uses the U1 symmetry group.
U1. And how many generators does that have?
It possesses just one generator. This group governs electromagnetism and quantum phase.
Okay, electromagnetism. So it is the reason photons exist and light shines.
Exactly. Second, it uses the SU2 symmetry group, which possesses 3 generators.
SU2 has 3. And what does it do?
This group governs the weak nuclear force, which is responsible for things like beta decay in radioactive materials.
Okay, weak force. And the last one?
Finally, it uses the SU3 symmetry group, which is much more complex and possesses 8 generators.
SU3 has 8.
Right. And this governs the strong nuclear force, which is the incredibly powerful glue that binds quarks together to form protons and neutrons.
Okay, let me do the math. We have 1 generator from U1, 3 generators from SU2, and 8 generators from SU3. 1 plus 3 plus 8 equals exactly 12 internal gauge generators.
That is the accepted textbook model.
But as successful as that 12-generator model is, and it has predicted the existence of countless particles before we ever even found them in colliders, Lilien has a massive fundamental critique of it.
His critique goes right back to the very first metaphor we used in this deep dive.
The stage and the actors.
Exactly. The standard model is a flawless description of the actors, but it completely ignores the existence of the stage. Standard physics has these 12 generators operating, exchanging particles, and interacting with incredible precision, but they are floating in an assumed void.
They just assume the theater is already built.
The standard model completely lacks an origin structure for the spatial arena itself. It just assumes that flat, predictable 3D space is already there for these quantum forces to play in.
It's doing physics inside the box without ever asking what the box is made of or how it stays rigid. It assumes the arena is free.
And we know from the curvature cost transition that the arena is not free.
Right. Space requires active stabilization.
This is exactly where the UCCF radically expands the standard model into what it calls the 15-generator closure envelope.
15 generators. So we are taking the standard 12 and we are adding 3 more. Where do these 3 missing generators come from?
They come from the SO3 mathematical group.
SO3. We talked about that earlier.
Yes. SO3 is the symmetry group that describes spatial rotational stabilization in 3 dimensions. It is the mathematical structure that ensures our 3D space remains coherent. It's the math that ensures space doesn't rip apart when a planet or a particle rotates within it.
Okay, so Lilien is saying you can't just ignore that.
The UCCF argues that you cannot logically append the 12 internal gauge forces without first securing the stable physical arena.
So if we look at Lilien's complete model, what he calls the channels of conserved coherence, we don't just have 3 quantum forces. We actually have 4 total sectors of reality.
Let's map them out.
The first is the foundational SO3 sector with its 3 generators. This provides spatial cohesion. It is the persistent, actively maintained physical arena.
The stage.
Yes, the stage. The second is the U1 sector with 1 generator. This provides phase cohesion.
And in the UCCF, electromagnetism isn't just some random force. It is the simplest, most direct physical expression of that original Euler phase seed we discussed.
It's how phase rotation manifests in the physical world.
Exactly. The third is the SU2 sector with 3 generators.
Right. Which provides bivector relational cohesion. It allows elements within the space to internally couple and relate to one another.
And the fourth is the SU3 sector with 8 generators, providing confinement cohesion. This creates strict, unbreakable boundaries, like the extreme confinement forces that trap quarks inside a proton so they can never escape.
So 3 generators for space, plus 1 for phase, plus 3 for relation, plus 8 for confinement. 3 plus 1 plus 3 plus 8 equals 15. The 15-generator closure envelope.
It perfectly balances.
But wait, I want to jump in and ask a clarifying question here, because I can hear physicists screaming through their headphones right now.
Oh, definitely. Let's address it.
Standard physics usually treats space and gravity, which warp space, as completely irreconcilable with the quantum forces of the standard model. They famously do not play well together.
That's the biggest problem in modern physics.
Right. So is Lilien saying that space is a quantum gauge force? Like, is there a space particle bouncing around?
Let me be very, very clear. No. He is not saying space is an internal gauge force mediated by discrete particles in the same way the strong or weak forces are. He's not proposing a graviton or some spatial boson here.
Okay, so what is he saying?
What he is saying is that space is an equal foundational part of the overarching resonance architecture.
Resonance architecture.
Remember how we said the excess curvature trickled down? The 15 generators are not 15 independent, unrelated phenomena that just happen to exist together. They are all differentiated resonance channels of a single, deeper source of coherence.
Oh, I see. So you can't have the actors without the stage. And the stage is made of the exact same conserved energy as the actors.
Precisely. You see, the SO3 spatial stabilization is the foundational closure condition that actually allows the other 12 generators to exist, calibrate, and operate. They are all necessary expressions of that initial excess curvature cooling down.
And there's a real mathematical elegance to the number 15 here, isn't there? Because 15 isn't just an arbitrary sum.
There is a profound algebraic correspondence that validates the number 15. The SU4 symmetry group, which is frequently explored in various grand unified theories in physics, mathematically requires exactly 15 generators.
What's the formula for that?
The algebraic formula is 4 squared minus 1, which equals 15. The UCCF treats this structural alignment not just as a neat mathematical coincidence, but as an ontological proof.
Proof of what?
It indicates that 15 is the absolute minimal completed envelope required for spatial, phase, bivector, and confinement sectors to stably coexist without unraveling.
It's basically the minimum viable product for a functioning physical universe.
Yeah.
If you only have 14, the universe falls apart.
Exactly. And that brings us to the ultimate grand-scale question of the entire framework.
Okay.
We have built the universe from pure predimensional mathematical logic. We watched it awaken through the Euler gateway. We saw the molten 3.14D threshold cool into a stable 3D space. And we watched the excess energy blossom into the 15-generator envelope that dictates all physical forces.
We did all that.
But what is the underlying rule driving all of this complexification? What is the ultimate purpose of this architecture?
This is where we get to the central unifying principle of the entire paper, the universal cohesion equation.
Mathematically, Lilien writes it as K equals C A plus R sub C.
Okay, K equals C A plus R sub C. Let's define those variables clearly for the listener.
K stands for cohesion.
Cohesion, okay?
C stands for the initial source coherence, that original unity from the seed equations.
Right.
And R sub C stands for resonant reduction, which is the complex, differentiated physical universe we live in.
And that A plus symbol, a circle with a plus sign inside it, represents a formal closure union or a deep integration.
Exactly. So if we translate the math into plain language, cohesion K is achieved when the original source coherence C remains permanently integrated with its own complex resonant reduction, R sub C.
Okay, I'm going to try to summarize what that actually implies about reality, and you tell me if I've got it.
Go for it.
It means that when the original unified predimensional seed layer fractured and differentiated into the wildly complex, messy, 15-generator physical universe, it didn't actually break.
No, it didn't.
Multiplicity-like, having lots of different particles and forces and dimensions, is not a failure of unity. When unity splits into complexity, it is simply differentiating into resonance.
Yes.
And as long as that underlying invisible unity remains mathematically integrated with its complex physical expression, the universe achieves cohesion.
That is a perfect synthesis. And cohesion, in this context, is just another word for persistent existence. It is the mechanism of reality holding itself together against entropy.
And this really redefines our very understanding of what space is at its core. Under the universal cohesion equation, space is not an empty container where things happen.
Not at all.
Space is literally defined as dimensional cohesion. It is pure logical coherence conserved through curvature resonance into a stable physical closure.
It is a stunningly beautiful definition of reality, but the implications of this equation go way beyond just quantum physics and the geometry of deep space.
It gets into biology, doesn't it?
It does. Lilien argues that this entire 15-generator structure is the minimal baseline architecture for what he calls life-admissible closure.
Life-admissible closure. This is where the framework becomes truly universal, bridging the gap between cold physics and biology.
Because the 15-generator envelope doesn't produce life mechanically. It's not a chemistry or biology equation.
Right, it doesn't just spawn a cell out of nowhere.
Exactly. But it provides the exact necessary structural setup for life to even be possible. Think deeply about what biological life requires to emerge and sustain itself.
Well, first and foremost, life requires a stable, persistent physical space to exist in. The space can't be violently expanding or collapsing every 5 seconds.
And that maps to our SO3 spatial cohesion sector.
Exactly. Secondly, biological life requires phase coherence so that atoms can bond, so that light can interact with matter, so that chemistry can even happen.
That is provided by the U1 phase sector.
Third, life requires relational coupling. Molecules must interact, proteins must fold, biological systems must organize and communicate internally.
And that organizational capacity maps to the SU2 bivector relational sector.
And finally, life requires confinement. It requires the ability to create strict boundaries.
Yes.
A biological organism must be able to say, this is the inside of the cell, and that is the outside environment. It has to maintain homeostasis. And that boundary-making capacity relies on the confinement logic of the SU3 sector.
So when you look at it through the lens of the universal cohesion equation, physical matter is just the first rung on the ladder.
The staircase of existence.
Matter is simply source resonance stabilized into form. Biology is that stabilized matter organizing itself to maintain dynamic boundaries against entropy.
Wow.
And cognition, human thought, consciousness, is that biological organization achieving a state of integrated self-reflective intelligence. The equation K equals C A plus R sub C applies perfectly at every single level of emergence.
So what does this all mean? For a quantum physicist, the equation explains how matter stays stable.
Right.
For an evolutionary biologist, it explains the logic of how a cell maintains its living identity against the chaos of the environment.
Exactly.
For a neuroscientist, it explains the mechanism of how you can hold a single, consistent thought or memory in your mind over time. It is the grand, unifying rule of persistence. It's the universal law that dictates here is exactly how things manage to exist instead of just falling apart into static chaos.
And it is vital to remember that all of this complex biology and cognition traces directly back to those initial predimensional invariant seed equations.
The source code.
Yes, coherence emerging from nullity, identity persisting through empty operations, infinity being bounded, unity returning safely through curvature. You are sitting in a room right now thinking thoughts that are the direct physical and cognitive expressions of those pure logical rules.
And that brings our journey full circle, because we started this deep dive looking at the boring, empty room you were sitting in.
The box.
Right. We all naturally assumed that space was just an empty box, a passive stage waiting for the actors to show up. But we went backstage today.
We went all the way backstage.
We started in the absolute unimaginable void of the predimensional seed layer, where reality was literally nothing but pure logical possibility. We swung the pencil through the Euler phase gateway, introducing curvature and rotation to the void. We watched the glowing, chaotic, molten 3.14D threshold cool and crystallize into our stable 3.0D reality.
And we discovered that the heat radiating off that cooling geometry birthed the 15-generator envelope of physical forces.
The forces that make your very existence, your chemistry, your biology, and your cognition entirely possible.
It is a profound and genuinely beautiful realization. The next time you look across an empty room or look up at the night sky, you shouldn't see nothingness. You should remember that the invisible space between you and the wall is highly active. It is a curvature-stabilized field of dimensional cohesion. It is an engine, constantly expending invisible energy, continuously working to maintain the stable physical arena you live your life in.
It is the ultimate illusion, powered by the most beautiful mathematics imaginable. But before we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, slightly provocative thought to mull over on your own.
Oh, this is a good one.
The UCCF framework tells us that the 3.14D threshold never went away. Through the principle of immanent generativity, it remains hidden in the background, actively projecting and maintaining our 3D space right now, which means our crisp, stable, physical reality is just a cooled-down reduction of a much deeper, curvature-rich field.
Of a surface layer.
Right. So it makes you wonder, if the physical universe we can see and measure is just the stabilized exhaust of a deeper generative threshold, what other predimensional thresholds might be lingering right in front of us, entirely undetected, just waiting for the right resonant structure to finally express themselves?
Something to think about.
Until next time, keep diving deep.